According to confidential communications intercepted from the Russian Ministry of Transport, the first alarm was not military but bureaucratic, a single, terse message marked urgent anomaly, cargo routing failure through Western Corridor. At first, it seemed like a technical glitch, a misplaced data packet in the digital map of Russia's supply lines. But within an hour, every signal confirmed the same truth: the corridor to Kaliningrad, the narrow land bridge through Poland and Lithuania that connected Moscow to its western enclave, was gone. Trains stood motionless on the rails, their engines idling like stranded beasts. Border lights that had blinked green for decades suddenly turned red. Drivers stepped out into the cold, staring at barriers that had come down without warning. Even the birds seemed to vanish from the gray sky above the crossings. The silence that followed was not confusion, it was comprehension. Every soldier, every operator, every customs officer understood what had happened before anyone dared say it aloud. The land bridge, the artery that carried everything from fuel and ammunition to medicine and food into the isolated Kaliningrad region, had been quietly, completely shut. No explosions, no headlines, no negotiations. Just a series of sealed gates and the soft click of disconnected networks. Poland had closed its border. Lithuania followed within the hour. The last link between mainland Russia and its western fortress was gone. Inside Moscow's ministries, the realization struck like a slow implosion. Maps were unrolled, calls made, orders issued in haste, revoked, and reissued again. The logistics networks that fed Kaliningrad's population, and more importantly, its garrison, depended on that narrow strip of land. For years, Moscow had treated the corridor as immutable, a geopolitical right rather than a privilege. Now, in a single morning, that assumption had turned to dust. According to internal memos later leaked by an anonymous source, senior officials were warned weeks earlier that tensions along the border were escalating. Intelligence briefings spoke of planned disruptions, of Polish and Lithuanian coordination under Article 4 contingencies. The warnings were ignored. Moscow's confidence was absolute. It always had been. The corridor, they believed, was untouchable, too critical to close, too dangerous to challenge. And yet, it was gone. For the first time in decades, Kaliningrad was not just isolated, it was marooned. The enclave, once described as the unsinkable aircraft carrier of Russia's western front, now hung in limbo, cut off from its lifeline. The Navy stationed there could still look toward the Baltic Sea, but every supply route from the east had turned into a dead end. The irony was brutal: a fortress without a bridge is just a prison with better uniforms. On the ground, the scene was surreal. Trains loaded with containers stood frozen between stations, their contents unknown even to the men guarding them. Some carried fuel, others, according to whispers, carried something far more valuable: classified hardware meant for Kaliningrad's missile systems. Now, all of it sat in the open, unguarded except by the cold. Polish and Lithuanian border agents patrolled in silence, taking photographs they would never publish. The line that once linked two worlds had turned into a scar. In the villages near the crossings, locals woke to find the night sky strangely bright, not from gunfire, but from floodlights and drones hovering overhead. Roads were closed, fields sealed, power flickering. Farmers watched as military convoys turned around, engines rumbling like thunder with nowhere to go. In the distance, you could hear train horns, long, drawn-out, mourning notes of machinery that had forgotten its destination. By midday, Moscow's official channels released a single statement: temporary technical suspension due to infrastructure maintenance. But the world already knew. Satellite images showed lines of freight stretching for kilometers, stationary shadows across the snow. The technical suspension was political reality, deliberate, total, and irreversible. Inside the Kremlin, the mood darkened. Advisors spoke of provocation, retaliation, escalation. But behind the rhetoric lay something deeper: humiliation. Russia's geography, once its greatest weapon, had turned against it. The empire that spanned 11 time zones was now learning what it meant to be trapped by its own borders. Our sources inside the Ministry of Defense describe an emergency session where the word corridor was spoken like a curse. No one dared to suggest reopening it by force, not yet. But everyone understood the message sent from Warsaw and Vilnius: you are surrounded, and you will stay surrounded. In Kaliningrad itself, panic spread quietly. Fuel reserves began to be rationed, warehouses sealed. Civilians were told to limit travel, while the garrison switched to independent operational readiness. Translation: prepare to hold out alone. The sea remained open, but NATO's presence turned it into a mirror of watchful eyes. The enclave had become a geopolitical island, a relic of empire cut adrift in the cold waters of the 21st century. By nightfall, Moscow's intelligence units sent their first encrypted summary to the Security Council. Its final line, brief and precise, would later leak through diplomatic backchannels: "The bridge is gone. The silence is total." That silence now stretches across the map, a gap not just of land, but of certainty. Russia's western artery has been severed, and in its absence, the machinery of empire has begun to stall. Stay with us. What happens when a nation built on movement finds itself trapped will not be written in reports, it will unfold in the quiet between borders. Subscribe, because what vanishes on maps often returns in the dark. According to intelligence fragments shared among European logistics monitors, more than 80 Russian freight trains now sit abandoned between Grodno and Mamanovo, silent, inert, their engines cold, their manifest sealed. Officially, they're delayed in transit. Unofficially, they've become relics of a geopolitical artery that no longer exists. The corridor between Russia and Kaliningrad, once called the lifeline of the West Front, has turned into a graveyard of steel. At first glance, the trains look ordinary: rusted wagons, faded numbers, snow gathering on roofs. But when analysts zoom in on high-resolution satellite imagery, the pattern is unmistakable: alternating formations of civilian freight and military cargo, positioned in such a way that no single convoy can be detached or rerouted without dismantling the whole chain. It's not logistics, it's entrapment. Each train now blocks the next, a perfect metaphor for the paralysis gripping Moscow's entire Western strategy. For decades, the Kaliningrad corridor was Russia's unspoken guarantee, the thin thread connecting its isolated garrison to the mainland, the route through which men, machinery, and supplies could move without drawing attention. Everything depended on it: food for civilians, spare parts for the navy, even encrypted mail from Moscow's intelligence hubs. Now that thread has snapped. And when an empire's arteries close, its pulse begins to falter. Inside Russia's transport ministry, panic hides behind procedure. A classified directive dated only hours after the blockade instructs officials to initiate redirection through northern maritime lanes. But that's a fiction. The Baltic Sea is no longer neutral water, it's a chessboard under NATO surveillance. Every shipment leaving St. Petersburg is tracked, scanned, and shadowed. The land route was the last unmonitored vein. Its closure is not an inconvenience, it's an amputation. Engineers stationed along the border call it the freeze. They describe trains stranded mid-route, their systems draining power hour by hour. Crews are forbidden to disembark, but supplies run low. "We are told to wait for clearance that never comes," one operator whispered over an intercepted radio frequency. The cargo hums when the wind passes through. You can feel it, like it's alive. Rumors circulate that some of the sealed wagons carry more than routine logistics. Western analysts speculate about advanced radar arrays, replacement parts for hypersonic systems, even nuclear components intended for Kaliningrad's missile base near Donskoy. Moscow denies it. But the secrecy surrounding the cargo, combined with the extraordinary security measures along the line, suggests that something inside those wagons is too valuable to admit, too dangerous to move. Meanwhile, the local populations along the Polish and Lithuanian borders have begun to sense the weight of history pressing against their soil. Villages near the tracks glow red at night from military floodlights. Drones hum overhead. The air smells faintly of diesel and frost. Children count the trains by their silhouettes, endless, identical, motionless. For them, the war has already arrived, just without sound. Inside Kaliningrad, the effects are immediate. Fuel depots begin rationing output, bakeries shorten hours, gas stations run dry. State television continues to broadcast calm optimism, but the tone has shifted. Instead of promises, there are slogans. Instead of information, there is repetition. Kaliningrad stands strong, the announcers say. The motherland provides. Yet behind those words, a question grows louder: what happens when the motherland can't reach its own hand? Western analysts watching the satellite feeds notice something peculiar: the trains are not merely stopped, they're guarded. Small detachments of armed personnel patrol them around the clock. That kind of vigilance is not for lost cargo, it's for secrets. One intelligence officer described it this way: it's as if Moscow buried something in plain sight and can't decide whether to dig it up or let it rust. In the Kremlin, high-level meetings stretch into the night. The military argues for transit enforcement, meaning a controlled breakthrough along the corridor by force. The foreign ministry warns that even one incursion could trigger a NATO response. The result is paralysis disguised as strategy. Decisions circulate endlessly between departments, each deferring to the next. The empire, built on command, now suffocates on hesitation. Behind the diplomatic language of supply disruption lies a quieter truth: Russia's geography has turned against it. The same vastness that once protected it now isolates it. Every kilometer of distance is a liability, every crossing a test of endurance. Kaliningrad, once a symbol of reach, has become the proof of limitation. By the end of the first week, the frozen trains become landmarks. Satellite analysts give them names: Convoy 0, Convoy East, Convoy Phantom. One stands half inside Poland, half in Belarus, a steel bridge between two worlds that no longer speak. The railmen inside burn their paperwork for warmth. Birds roost on antennas that were meant for coded transmissions. The world watches, fascinated and horrified, as an empire that prided itself on motion becomes a tableau of stillness. And through it all, Moscow maintains the same line: transit delays will be resolved through diplomatic dialogue. But the dialogue has already ended. The silence from Warsaw is deliberate, from Vilnius, absolute. Europe has discovered a new kind of weapon, not missiles, but distance. For Russia, the shock is not material, it is existential. Power, once projected outward, now bounces back against invisible walls. The land bridge that once symbolized connection has become a mirror, reflecting a simple, brutal message: your reach has limits. As night falls over the abandoned corridor, the cold deepens. The trains no longer hum, they creak. Somewhere among the wagons, a single radio still transmits, repeating the same signal, coordinates without context, a plea without an answer. Stay with us. The steel may have stopped, but what it carries, secrets, anger, and unfinished orders, has only begun to move. Subscribe, because the frozen convoy is not the end of the story, it's the start of a reckoning rolling toward the dark. According to encrypted communication logs obtained by Western intercept units, Moscow's rail command centers have descended into quiet chaos. Operators receive orders that contradict one another every hour. Some trains are told to reverse course toward Belarus, others are ordered to maintain stationary defense. That phrase, once meaningless, has now become doctrine. Nobody moves, nobody decides, nobody speaks above a whisper. The land bridge may be closed, but inside the Russian network, confusion itself has become a battlefield. At the dispatch hubs near Smolensk, radio chatter sounds like a language collapsing under its own weight. Fragments of panic, clipped phrases, half-coded signals: shadow cargo at Junction 7. Fuel critical. Awaiting green. No response. Just static, then silence. The silence stretches for hours until another message arrives, identical but from a different train. Shadow cargo, the phrase repeats across hundreds of transmissions. It's never explained. Intelligence analysts now believe it refers to the convoys carrying classified systems bound for Kaliningrad. The kind of material that cannot be abandoned, but cannot be admitted either. Meanwhile, Moscow broadcasts calm. The official version remains unchanged: transit negotiations are proceeding. But internally, the tone is frantic. A memo leaked from the Ministry of Defense describes escalating logistic degradation in Western District Command. It warns of irreversible deterioration if the blockade continues beyond 2 weeks. That phrase, irreversible deterioration, appears again in reports from the Fuel Authority, from the military commissariats, even from civilian energy regulators. Each one using the same words, as if dictated from the same invisible hand. The system, built on control, now repeats itself like an echo chamber. In the small towns near the sealed crossings, locals begin to hear strange broadcasts at night. Low-frequency bursts on old shortwave channels, rhythmic, mechanical, coded. To the untrained ear, it sounds like static. But technicians in Vilnius confirm it's a modified military pattern, repeating coordinates that no longer exist. One Lithuanian officer described it bitterly: they're calling to places that are gone. Ghost signals for a ghost corridor. For the men trapped inside the trains, the ordeal turns surreal. Food runs out, heaters fail, radios die. Some cruise desert under cover of darkness, walking across frozen fields toward neutral borders. Others remain, loyal to duty or fear. They sit in silence, surrounded by cargo they are forbidden to open, while the frost grows thick on the windows. When one convoy attempted to restart its engines last week, a drone appeared overhead within minutes. Nobody knows whose it was: Polish, NATO, or Russian. It hovered for a moment, then left, leaving only the echo of its propellers in the fog. Back in Moscow, the political language begins to fracture. Hardliners call for decisive measures, meaning a military breakthrough. Diplomats argue for restraint. But neither side can admit the truth: the confrontation has already begun, only in a form they can't control. The trains have become the front line, the border both real and psychological. Russia's power no longer extends through rails and roads, it echoes through static, trapped between maps that no longer connect. According to sources within the Security Council, the president demanded a report on the status of mobility. The document he received was only 2 pages long. The final line read: mobility remains intact on paper. That phrase spread like infection through the bureaucracy, copied into briefings, repeated in meetings, printed in headlines. The fiction of movement became the new form of control. As long as the illusion of transit exists, collapse can be postponed another day. Yet, far from Moscow, reality is colder. The Kaliningrad garrison sends encrypted distress messages requesting resupply. They are acknowledged but not answered. Supplies dwindle. Families are evacuated quietly under the cover of infrastructure maintenance. Civilian ferries that once carried passengers now carry soldiers, their decks hidden beneath tarpaulins. On the docks, you can hear the whispers, "They're running out." Meanwhile, the Polish and Lithuanian authorities maintain their silence. They do not announce the blockade, they do not comment, they simply enforce. Border cameras go dark at night, replaced by infrared patterns that sweep across the fields like searchlights. For the first time since the end of the Cold War, the frontier breathes with the rhythm of fear. You can feel it in the air, dense, metallic, waiting. Foreign analysts describe the situation as a psychological siege. No weapons fired, no troops crossed, yet an entire region is suffocating. The strategy is elegant in its cruelty: deny access, force patience to break, let panic replace action. In Moscow, every new report from the West sounds the same: frozen assets, immobile convoys, no resolution. The silence from Kaliningrad grows heavier by the day. And still, the trains wait. Night after night, their shadows stretch across the snow like scars that refuse to fade. The men inside whisper to each other through dead radios, voices that no longer expect replies. Theirs is a war without movement, a war of waiting, of watching, of listening to nothing until nothing becomes unbearable. A Western observer called it the first battle fought entirely in suspension. No explosions, no victories, just the slow realization that power can be destroyed by stillness. Stay with us. The voices trapped in transit are growing restless, and sooner or later, something in the silence will have to break. Subscribe, because when the first train finally moves, it won't just carry cargo. It will carry consequence. According to documents circulating inside Russia's Security Council Secretariat, the paralysis along the Kaliningrad line has entered its terminal stage. The reports are repetitive, almost ritualistic: awaiting clearance, awaiting confirmation, awaiting instruction. 3 sentences that describe not only the state of the trains but of the nation itself. No one dares to make a decision, because every decision now feels like treason against someone higher up, and no one is sure who that someone is anymore. Inside Moscow's ministries, the meetings have turned ghostly. Officials gather in rooms heavy with recycled air, repeating the same phrases in softer and softer voices. Maps lie on tables like relics from a vanished world, their lines meaningless. One senior planner reportedly stared at the red-marked corridor for nearly an hour before whispering, "We lost it the same way we lost everything else, slowly, then all at once." His words were never recorded, but they spread through the building like a rumor of conscience. At the Federal Transport Agency, investigators work in circles. They file reports that will never be read, organize committees that will never meet, schedule reviews that will never occur. The machinery of bureaucracy has become self-sustaining, a perpetual motion of avoidance. To survive in this system now means not to solve, but to wait. And waiting, in Moscow's logic, is obedience. In Kaliningrad, the waiting has become survival. The city lives on ration fuel and manufactured optimism. Propaganda broadcasts speak of temporary logistical adjustments, but the markets tell a different story. Prices double overnight. Electricity flickers. Families whisper about evacuation routes that no longer exist. The population pretends to believe because disbelief is dangerous. Soldiers patrol the streets not as protectors, but as reminders. The enclave has become a mirror reflecting everything Moscow fears to admit: isolation, dependence, decline. Meanwhile, the internal purges have begun. The first dismissals came quietly: mid-level transport officials accused of procedural sabotage. Then came the arrests: logistics officers, regional governors, even a retired admiral once responsible for Baltic supply routes. Each case is presented as justice. Each one deepens the fear. The real crime, everyone knows, is failure, and failure is now contagious. Inside the Kremlin, the language of control has shifted. The word bridge is no longer spoken, it has been replaced by alternative connectivity. Orders are issued to create new routes through friendly corridors. No one specifies which corridors these are, because none exist. The phrase is a spell, repeated to hold the illusion together. Beneath it, the truth rots quietly: the westward artery of the Russian state has been cut, and nothing will bring it back. Intelligence sources describe growing disarray within the general staff. Some argue that the blockade must be broken by force, a show of strength to remind the world that Russia still breathes. Others warn that such a move would trigger the one thing Moscow cannot afford, a direct clash with NATO. Between these extremes lies paralysis. Generals pace their offices at night, staring at maps that no longer respond to orders. The system was built to expand, not to endure containment. Now, trapped within its own geography, it suffocates on its own design. Foreign satellites capture haunting images, long columns of idle freight glowing faintly under snow, their outlines ghostly in infrared. The analysts who study these photos call them steel specters. In their stillness lies an unspoken message: this is what empire looks like when movement ends. Inside one of those frozen trains, a conductor reportedly kept a log even after his radio went silent. The entries stopped on the 6th day. The final line read, "The snow covers everything now. Even the sound." That notebook was later recovered by a drone. The handwriting was steady until the end. Back in Moscow, censorship has tightened. News anchors speak with forced brightness. They call the situation a challenge to be overcome through unity. But even the loyal audience senses the hollowness. You can't hide a missing bridge from a nation that measures its life in distance. The more they deny, the more the silence spreads, a silence that feels not empty, but full of everything unsaid. For the first time, foreign diplomats in Moscow describe the government's tone as defensive. Behind closed doors, officials ask for technical dialogue, humanitarian transit, anything that would restore the illusion of control. But Warsaw and Vilnius no longer answer. Europe has discovered the final lever of power, not confrontation, but absence. By closing the corridor, it forced Russia to look at its reflection and see not might, but dependence. Now, the land bridge exists only in memory, a phantom artery drawn on maps that history has already erased. The trains rust where they stand, the cables hum with no signal, and the empire that once defined itself by motion has turned into a monument of stillness. Stay with us. The ghosts of the corridor have not finished their journey, they're moving elsewhere, through silence, through cracks in the system that no one dares to trace. Subscribe, because the next sound you hear won't be from the rails, it will be from what's breaking beneath them. According to confidential notes from Moscow's Internal Crisis Commission, the final decision came not as a command but as surrender. The directive, signed quietly at dawn, declared the Kaliningrad land corridor non-operational until further notice. No public statement followed. No ceremony, no defense, no outrage. The silence was deliberate, the last act of control in a situation that had already escaped it. After months of denial, the Kremlin simply stopped mentioning the bridge at all. That was how its death was confirmed. Across the borderlands, the frozen convoys began to fade into the landscape. Snow buried the rails. Rust ate through the hinges of forgotten freight doors. Animals nested in empty cars once sealed by military order. The corridor, once described in strategy manuals as the artery of Western access, now looked like a museum of paralysis. To anyone passing by, it was just a string of broken shapes stretching toward nowhere. But to those who understood, it was the tomb of a doctrine, the belief that geography alone could guarantee power. In Kaliningrad, rationing became permanent. The last supply shipments arrived by sea under escort, each delivery smaller than the last. The city's lights still burn, but dimmer. The naval port operates on half capacity. Families learn to live without imports, without news, without certainty. There are no protests, only quiet adaptation, the kind born from generations of obedience. The enclave survives, but not as part of anything larger. Its people no longer speak of connection, they speak of endurance. Inside Moscow, a different kind of frost has set in. Ministries avoid the topic of the blockade as if it were contagious. The words corridor, Kaliningrad, and transit have been scrubbed from internal briefings. Officials now refer vaguely to regional restructuring. In public, they project confidence. In private, they rewrite history. The new narrative claims the land bridge was never essential, that self-sufficiency was always the goal. But even the writers of that story don't believe it. The truth lingers like a draft through the walls of the Kremlin. They lost not territory, but continuity. The empire's map is no longer whole. For decades, Russia's strength lay in motion, the endless flow of trains, pipelines, ships, convoys, the constant pulse of empire across impossible distances. When that motion stopped, so did something deeper, the illusion of control. You cannot command stillness, you can only endure it. The corridors that once carried power now carry ghosts, not soldiers, not cargo, but echoes of what was once certainty. Foreign analysts describe the moment as the end of geography. The line that once connected Russia to the heart of Europe has turned into a fault, marking the divide between two worlds that will never touch again. NATO watches quietly, understanding that the victory is already complete. No troops crossed the border. No missiles flew. The bridge collapsed not from attack, but from consequence. It's how modern empires die, not with war, but with disconnection. And yet, within the silence, something faintly human remains. Along the abandoned tracks, locals collect scrap metal for fuel. Children play among the snow-covered carriages, their laughter carried through the wind. The same rails that once divided now belong to no one. The corridor has become a memory reclaimed by the land. It's as if the earth itself decided to erase the arrogance of maps and begin again. In one recovered dispatch from the final convoy, a conductor left a last entry in his logbook: "We were told to wait for orders. None came." Perhaps this was the order. That sentence now circulates through underground channels as a kind of epilogue, not of defiance, but of awakening. It captures what Moscow cannot admit and what the world already knows: that power built on denial always ends in silence. When the thaw finally comes, the rails will gleam again, but they will lead nowhere. The land bridge will remain a scar on the continent, a reminder that every empire has a final station where movement ends, and truth begins. And perhaps that is how history closes its chapters now, not with an explosion, but with stillness so complete that even memory hesitates to cross it. If you've followed this far, remember what was said in the beginning: that silence often tells more than speech. Stay close, because silence like this never lasts. Something always moves beneath it. Subscribe, because when the next bridge breaks, it won't just be steel and soil, it will be the map itself.